Bianca Cunningham is an organizer for Communications Workers of America, chair of the NYC-DSA Labor Branch, and member of the DSA AfroSocialist and Socialists of Color Caucus. Tania Bhattacharyya is a PhD candidate at Columbia-UAW and an organizer for the Graduate Workers of Columbia Union. Benjamin Dictor is an attorney with Eisner and Dictor, primarily representing workers, labor unions, and worker centers before state and federal courts. Prior to this, he was an organizer with the Industrial Workers of the World. And our moderator tonight, Brice Cova, is a journalist whose work focuses on the economy. She is a contributing op-ed writer to the New York Times and The Nation, amongst others. And in 2016, she won the Exceptional Merit in Media Award from the National Women's Political Caucus. Please join me in welcoming our speakers tonight.
This is on, yep. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you guys all for coming out on this very balmy February evening. I think we're gonna have a really great discussion in front of us. So before we get into sort of the nitty-gritty of organizing, because I think all of you have a really interesting perspective to bring to that question, I wanted to start first with something related but a little bit different, which is to talk about the working class. Because the election that we just went through talked a lot about the working class, and in the aftermath of it, the media talks a lot about the working class, and I think there's perhaps a lot of misconceptions about who is the working class, what do they look like, where do they work, what do they do, and I think that would help ground the conversation because these are also probably the people who we're talking about when we talk about organizing workers and trying to build worker power. So I think each of you might have something interesting to say about that if you each want to sort of weigh in, both on, and expansively and also in your experience working with your coworkers or the people you're organizing, you know, who are they? What do they do? If anyone wants to jump in first.
Is this working? Okay, great. Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me here. And my organizing perspective here comes mostly from being an organizer with Graduate Workers of Columbia, which is the union of graduate TAs and RAs at Columbia University. I'm also an international student, so it's a particular perspective on graduate worker organizing. So my answer to the question of who is the working class, but I will keep it to talking about the question of graduate workers being part of the working class. But I think when you ask that question specifically with respect to graduate workers in America, there's a tendency to treat it like a theoretical question because of this, like the conditions of labor law in America, which are very specific, and you know the way we've been fighting this battle in courts, which is all about, are you a worker or are you a student who's really an apprentice? And that really obfuscates, I think, what is not a theoretical question, but a question about, it's a structural question about the state of education and higher education in the United States of America, but also elsewhere. So I think if we think about not from the perspective of the individual graduate worker and what role the work aspect has compared to the education aspect, but the role that these graduate workers perform in the context of higher education as an increasingly commodified, corporatized service. And within that structure, what we see is within booming higher education, there is an increasing the casualization of labor, basically. So increasingly, the job of education is performed not by tenured faculty, but by part-time, non-tenure track, adjuncts, postdocs, and graduate workers. So if you see graduate workers as a part of this structure of education industry and the role that graduate workers play in providing this service, then there's really no doubt that you're part of the working class. And if we just talk numbers, for example, I think in 2015, wait, I had statistics down here. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are 64,000 steel workers, but 820,000 home health aides in the United States of America. So there is clearly a shift in numbers, if you're just talking numbers. So if you bring that into the graduate worker context, I think AFT alone has 25,000 unionized grad workers, and that's just the workers who've been unionized by, the largest union of grad workers. So if you can only imagine, if you compare that with the 64,000 steel workers in the USA, this is clearly an expanding group in the working class. So.
Yeah, I tend to think about I think we all think about the working class the way the media portrays it, which is like white men, right? When I go to, it's always disappointing when I go to community organizations, whether it's a Black Lives Matter meeting or whatever, and I talk about unions because I'm a union activist, and they say, do you mean those white guys in the hard hats? And that's how they actually view like the working class. I myself define the working class as anybody who works for a wage. I think that there's other classifications like middle class and lower income people, and it's really funny when you ask middle class people, they'll say they're working class, and when you ask lower income people, they'll say they're middle class. Or they're, so I think there is some kind of like confusion about what actually the working class is, but it is a fact that Black and brown people make up the working class of America, or so it's a misconception, but yes.
Yeah, I think I have kind of a boring answer to that question, and I think that the working class, someone is of the working class if they have to sell, like what you said, if you have to sell your labor for a wage, and if someone else is extracting profit from your labor. I mean, I think that's the sort of maximal understanding I read in some book by some German guy once, like a long time ago. But, I think that's true, and, there are, I think, different sections of the working class experience sort of the exploitation of capitalism differently, and that has to be recognized in the work that we do, in both organizing work and in my case, in the practice of law in support of organizing work. It's something that we have to be conscious of. And I love what you said about sort of the subjective understanding that sort of like it's really hard to find people that you're working with that see themselves as working class. And I think one of the roles I see sort of organizers playing in that is to sort of get folks to embrace that and like raise their consciousness, to get people to understand that if you're having your labor exploited for someone else's profit, you're working class.
With this more expansive idea of what the working class is, and you started to hint at this already, I wonder if you guys can also talk about how has the working class changed, and if our conception is the steel worker who goes to a factory job with a hard hat on and works 9 to 5, or I guess maybe factory hours and overnight shift, is the working class, are the jobs that the working class does changing, and how that interacts with organizing them? Are they becoming more contingent, more, different than that factory floor job?
I'll start if it's okay. So I organize wireless workers primarily, which is a retail work environment. I also have worked in a retail work environment most of my life. It's my experience in my own union that they for some time tried to organize retail workers. I think that most of working class right now is what we would call like service industry or pink collar, home healthcare workers as well, domestic workers. I think that we're a little bit behind in organizing, so we're trying to play catch up. I was just saying to somebody earlier, it was like you see all these like retail shutdowns, right? And like big box stores are closing, and like you see in favor of like online, like we should be moving to like tech worker organizing, but we're still trying to wrap our heads around retail organizing. So we are certainly behind in that aspect, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that jobs and the working class are maybe they're not the those two things don't equal one another. The jobs are always changing, technology is changing, the market is changing, and capitalism is in this kind of like constant state of rearranging itself. And I think from a union kind of organizing perspective, we're having a hard time catching up with it. I think that's 100% correct. Addressing things like the whatever they're calling it today, fractured workforce, fissured workforce, try to catch up with the isolation of workers working alone or doing contract work. We've got a lot of things. I think that the working class today, in terms of the way that it's structured, looks a lot different than it used to look. But I don't think that the working class itself has changed. I think it goes back to that the working class are people that are having their labor exploited. So that's been since the dawn of capitalism, and today it's just, we've come up with these sort of fancy structural ways to insulate employers from, largely to insulate employers from liability, and redefine people. You're not an employee, you're a contractor, you know, or, you know, you're an itinerant worker, and we try to diminish your rights as a result of that. But I mean, I think a lot of this is just sort of legal rebranding, like I said, for the purpose of insulating employers from liability.
Yeah, actually, I think of the legal rebranding also as a very interesting public education project. And so, like, in the process of fighting these battles legally, it's not so much that we have to depend entirely on whether the law accepts us as workers or not, but in the protracted process of fighting these battles, more and more people, that's organizing, right? Like, you have these conversations with people, and in the process, you get them to think of themselves as workers if they haven't before. And, it's not like it's called the 21st Century Shop, this event, right? But the first union of graduate TA and assistants is actually not 21st century. I think TAA and UW Madison is from 1966. So it's an older idea. So the idea, of course, existed much earlier that graduate TAs are workers, but for that to catch up and like become what we are now calling a movement, but it's really catching on in different parts of the country, is like a combination of various factors. So it is the blowing up of the educational sector, it is the various changing administrations and the law and how it changes with that and how that gives new windows of opportunity for organizing. And so yeah, I would say that while our understanding of what the working class is does not necessarily change, historically with changing political moments, the ways in which different sections organize and present themselves as an organized labor force is definitely changing. And it increasingly involves, you know, precarious labor. I mean, I think working class life always involved precarity, but you know, this kind, especially in the academic world, this sort of like short-term employment and this radical uncertainty about what the next round of employment is going to be is something that's a feature of current organizing.
Yeah, I was wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about that particularly, and whether, you know, talk about the challenges you face. You know, you've all worked with people trying to organize them. Some of the biggest challenges you face, but also particularly, does precarity or chaotic schedules or, you know, contractors, the fractured workplace, I suppose, if you can fit all of that under one umbrella, present particular challenges for people who are trying to organize workers today?
I mean, I think it does, and I think and it's kind of a legal question. I mean, that's maybe it's just the lens that I look at everything through, but I think that it presents a particular problem and a particular obstacle in the way that we allow sort of the ruling class political and legal institutions to define us and then sort of, you know, limit us from accessing certain rights on that basis. But I think that at the end of the day, it's not a particularly new issue, and it's not something that I think has prevented people from organizing. There are great associations of contract workers who maybe don't have collective bargaining rights, but there are various guilds, there are trade associations, people coming together and, you know, asserting collective power. There have been unions of people who might have been seen as itinerant workers. I think about like the musician Teamsters is a great example of how you have people that are not, you know, have some element of precarity, is that the word? To their work, you know, they're working at a different club every night, things like that, but they were able to come together and exercise really significant economic power on those employers. So, you know, I think it's an obstacle, but at the same time, I think there are solutions. And they may not be really comfortable legal solutions, like we're not going to legislate our way out of this. We're not going to get, I mean, in our lifetimes with the Gorsuch Court, we're not going to see judicial resolution of any of these outstanding issues. But I think that through economic power and through direct action, there are quite a number of things that can be done. So, you know, obstacle, yes, but not one that's insurmountable.
I agree with what he said, obviously. I think that I'm just thinking about two examples in my head that I know off the top, which is one of them is when CWA organized home health aides in New Jersey. And because they don't have like a work site, right, they had to do, I wasn't a part of that, house visits. So that's a normal thing that a union would do, come to your house, knock on your door, because it's the only way they're gonna be able to reach you, because there's no like workplace outside to stand. they were able to win in that instance. I think that I'm thinking about the difference between that and like when we try to organize call centers, have tried to organize call centers, what normally happens is that they end up closing them and then giving folks an option to move down south to where they move the call center to. And now when you're in a room of organizers and you say call center, everybody kind of just shakes their head and with an understanding that we're never going to organize them, mostly because of the different shifts, the changing shifts. There's 1,000 people in a call center and there's 30 shifts. And I think maybe the difference is, and I'm just thinking about this now, so I could be wrong, but I think maybe the difference is that home health aides, while we had to visit their homes to have access to them, that also means that the employer has somewhat access to them, but not as much as they do in a call center when you're on an 8 or 9 hour shift, and like totally they can do captive audience meetings and take you off the phone. So maybe that's the difference. So there could be obstacles that are different depending on the occupation, I think.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Benjamin that it's that the precarity is what makes it difficult. It's a challenge, but it's also the site of potential. So to use just one example, I mean, the most precarious workers are also the ones who are most scared sometimes to openly affiliate with the union because they're worried that the employer can then take advantage of their precarity and therefore make them even more vulnerable. So in our experience of organizing at Columbia, for example, international students are this big group that are always concerned about very basic things that might sometimes appear obvious, but like, is it legal for us to belong to the union, or will our status, can our visa status lapse just because we joined a union, so on and so forth. But so while that is a challenge, because it's very difficult to have those conversations, there's a lot of mistrust and fear. It's also, once you start having those conversations, and if you can really display to them through work and organizing, which is what we did at Columbia, that you're actually safer if you're organized. So, because the university is very often not going to listen to you when you go to them with a problem, unless there's something particularly motivating them to do so. I mean, sometimes they will, but very often they won't. So I found it personally, and I know countless others have at Columbia through organizing experience, is that while you're nervous at first, when you organize and you present, like we do various things like signature campaigns or protests, and like around the travel ban, for example, we really came together and you mobilize not only international students in the process, but also American students, and so that, you know, the precarity becomes a grounds for real solidarity. And yeah, I think that's one of the most potential future organizing. And I think it's not just thinking, but like the grad union gives you a way of thinking about immigrants in the workforce in general, and I think unions in America in general can do a lot to secure greater protections for immigrants. So I think with healthcare workers, Unite here in Chicago and LA, like negotiated specifically, like, you know, regulations which are very clearly immigrant friendly. So it's to do with, you know, like getting the employer to commit to not implement more than what absolutely legally has to be done. So we copied some of that, for example, around the travel ban, saying you're not going to commit to not handing over any I-20 information unless you're required by law or you're subpoenaed, refuse to hand over DACA students' status unless subpoenaed, for so on and so forth. And these are things that can be put into a contract, which we hope we will soon, one day.
Along those lines, are there any other like strategies or tactics that you guys have developed or feel are particularly important to use in today's economy, or just with the kinds of workforces that you're trying to organize?
Strategies are tactics. I mean, I always tell the truth. That's my strategy. You don't see that a lot. I'm straight with people when you want to organize. I think it's really there's like a romanticizing around like the way union organizers present things sometimes. Like you could have benefits, you could have a pension, you could have all these things that the union fought for. And in today's economy, the reality is that you could have those things, but it's going to be a hell of a fight. And I'm not even sure that most people are even prepared for that. But we hope that we find those people who are ready to go to war. It's really scary when you're, I mean, it's really scary when you're not working, when you're working against the boss, right? Because he has so much time and money. And it's one thing that like we don't have a lot of, so.
in terms of tactics, I get to be in this really nice position where I work for organizers, and I work for like really smart organizers in a variety of unions. So, the tactics come from them. And to the extent we have a tactic in our practice of law, it's to find a way to make it work for the organizers that we're working with. There's a real compulsion for a lawyer to sort of always tell you what you're doing wrong and like caution you against things, and it's always going to be there. It's part of our ethical obligations, and I've had some of my favorite fights with organizers that I'm working with as a result. But I think that I try to learn, and I always do learn a great deal from the people I'm working with. So that could be a very traditional organizing campaign. We just got done doing some work with the News Guild of New York for the LA Times workers out in LA that successfully unionized after 136 years of being crushed by various fascist sort of owners of the company. Very interesting story. But at the same time, like at the exact same time, we're doing work supporting solidarity unionism of the IWW at Ellen's Stardust Diner and the Stardust Family United, if you've heard about that and sort of what they're doing, the singing servers. So, those are two very different models of organizing. Solidarity unionism, for those of you who don't know, is like you don't push for a contract, you don't push for recognition. It's constant direct action, like entrenched long-term direct action to get what you want. And the lawyer in me is sort of like, that sounds exhausting. You want a contract. And then on the other hand, the very traditional organizing, whenever I'm doing that, I'm thinking like, we need more direct action. Like, this is totally unacceptable. We need more direct action. So I'm always kind of caught between the very good and successful tactics of the various brilliant organizers that I get the pleasure of working with.
We always say in the war room, in the organizers' room, to the attorneys that their job is to get us out of trouble, not to tell us what we can't do.
Yeah, we also thought, I think what we found in organizing was to display more than claim. So in the first couple of years before we won the battles in court, when we, the right to like recognition as workers legally, we would just organize unofficial, but we had what we call working groups, and we would organize and put pressure on the administration, and we got various things out of them, like a bunch of new scholarships and funding, pointing out the different statuses of different kinds of students, and then once you have a solid body of like achievements and things that sort of unofficial collective bargaining can achieve, and then you take that to workers, it's much more convincing to them that this is a strategy that can work. But the other trick with organizing in grad school is the tricky nature of like the privilege and precarity thing, right? Like there is a great deal of privilege in how you organize, but which people are often very aware of as well, and there are like it's working class, we're all workers, but everybody's not, definitely people don't come from the same class backgrounds, and after we finish in grad school, we are not all going to have the same kind of jobs. People in the STEM fields will have different futures, and even within the STEM and within social sciences, there are all kinds of differentiations. So what you have to do is like, whatever strategies you evolve have to keep pointing to the nature of the work they do now, irrespective of what their relative privileges might be now or in the future. So it's always good to talk about the conditions in which you feel disempowered or exploited, and then to think of ways in which like banding together with your fellow workers might get you a solution that simply appealing to the care narrative of your not employers does.
So I know you at some point said that we're not going to get any change anytime soon, which is probably right. But I wonder if you guys can still talk about the ways in which our current institutions, laws that sort of govern all of this, that you're interacting with to try and organize workers. Are they outdated? Are there ways in which, if we could see change, they need to change to better reflect today's economy, if they were built and created during a time when we thought everybody was like a white man going to a factory? Can think big.
Well, I think that one thing that a lot of folks forget is that one of labor's strongest points in terms of the influence it was able to sort of have was at a time when union organizing was illegal in many states. I mean, beyond you don't have dues check off, that's coming, right? But it was illegal. I mean, you could go to jail because you and your coworker getting together and demanding a higher wage and threatening to strike was considered a conspiracy against capital, like a conspiracy against your boss. You know, the sit-down strikes, you know, famous example of a pre the law as we understand it today version of organizing that was extraordinarily effective. So, you know, there are scholars who say, do away with the entire National Labor Relations Act. Like, do away with the whole thing, and let's go back to the way that we had it before. We don't need it. It itself creates all of these problems for workers. And I go back and forth between agreeing with that and like strongly disagreeing with that. But I think the biggest problem in terms of the way that the law has changed is the fact that it keeps changing. I think that like the volatility of it, you talk about graduate workers, it's like the volatility of the law concerning graduate workers alone is enough to drive you mad. I mean, we really don't know what's gonna happen, and it keeps changing. At the beginning of December, the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board issued a memo basically telling the world, we're gonna be throwing out your 7 pages of cases of Obama-era precedent that we've organized under. So we have to rework it. So we have to be as volatile. We have to have a level of, I guess, dynamism to match the level of volatility in the law. And that's not easy, but I think it can be done. And frankly, maybe we should return to a world where we can go back to the sit-down strike and they can cart us off to jail. And maybe we have to shut down the economy to get the things that we want again.
Yeah, I see in my own union and other unions like the service model unionism where you're just a dues payer and you see your union as somebody who represents you when you get in trouble, and then there's no mobilization around that, and it's just really to serve your members internally. I think that leadership is now, in the last at least 3 years, coming to the realization that you can't survive as a union unless you're working intersectionally with the community. So it has to be more than just an attack on your boss, right? It has to be talking about the ways that capital affects your whole life, whether it's your housing situation, you know, and other things. It's not just your boss. And so you see examples like the runaway inequality workshops where we're trying to, in a lot of ways, our leadership is way more progressive than our membership and doesn't understand, and is really angry, saying, I pay dues and I don't understand why you want to support Bernie, or why my dues should go to talking about, you know, the climate justice, or, you know, the environment. Like, this is not what the union's supposed to do, but what we're trying to do is educate our members and the rank and file about why it's important, and why, in order for the union to survive, we're going to have to expand and start talking about the issue on a broader level. And I would just add that the law, as an organizer, that most affects what I do, and what I'm really upset about, is that Obama had brought in like something called the quick election, where you could go to election in under 3 weeks, which is a huge deal because it really minimizes the pressure that you get from the boss, right? I myself went through a 3-month anti-union campaign, and there's a lot of like volatility in who's supporting and who's not because of intimidation and other things. So 3 weeks just really makes it really quick and easy, and you have less people flipping. As you said, it's now changing, and it's going to go back to like pre-Bush era. So who knows? Maybe it'll be like 6 months. I have no idea, but that sucks. Yeah.
Well, I have 2 responses actually to the volatility of the legal status around unionization here. One is that we both have to be more dynamic, but we have to be more resilient, in the sense that we can't wait for our future to depend on what the next legal regime is going to say. We've been organizing for years now, and we have to keep building that strength, so that even if the law decides now that Columbia is not obliged to recognize us, we should, through direct action and other means, make it incumbent and like impossible for Columbia to not. Because clearly the law saying you have to negotiate with us is not making a difference to Columbia. You might know that they have the resources to delay us through the courts for as long as they need to, and then when the court finally goes against them, they're still powerful enough to say, we don't care, we're going to wait this out even longer. So it can't, in a sense, depend on what the legal regime says in terms of organizing. Of course, we're going to use it and work with it as long as we can, but if they're not, then it has to be, I'm hoping that the labor movement in America is like going to be stronger, in that it sort of outlives these sort of weird changes in the legal system. And the other thing I'm thinking, again, as not American, as an international, is that maybe in terms of vision, like thinking not just from American history, but also looking at unions elsewhere, and hopefully one day there will be a situation where the law actually doesn't even have to question whether it's people's rights to have unions. I mean, this whole debate about should we have a union, are we allowed to have a union, was very novel for me when I arrived. I was like, what do you mean you can't have a union? Like, everyone has a union. But like in the United Kingdom, for example, they have the UCU, right? Universities and Colleges Union, and now PhD students are members for free. They don't have to pay dues to be a member of the UCU, and they're increasing. So they are also including the new, more precarious part-time workers. It has its own problems, but at least having a union is just not debated. They're fighting other things. Right now they're fighting cutting of pensions. So they are fighting their battles, but the battle is not about do we have a right to have a union. And I think we should hope that one day in America too, it will no longer be a debating point about whether workers have a right to have unions. And I mean, I don't exactly know how that's going to happen. I'm a very late entry in the labor scene here, but I think it's fair to have that as a vision, because it's definitely possible. It happens elsewhere in the world, and it can happen here too.
These are all the challenges that you guys face. What's most exciting about organizing today? Or is there something that's new and different that feels like a new opportunity for organizing today?
So the latest statistic is that for the first time in maybe 20 years, union members have grown. The amount of union members has grown from in 2017 by 262,000 members, I believe it is. 75% of those members are 35 and under. And so I'm looking at millennials. And I think it's really exciting. It's unfortunate that, well, it's not. They're disillusioned with capitalism. The job market is really bad. And I think that they're starting to realize that their grandparents were onto something with this union thing. And so I'm specifically excited. I organize in the wireless industry, retail industry, which is overwhelmingly people under 35. And I think there's also a great opportunity now where you see like the Teamsters creating like sanctuary workplaces. I think there's an opportunity in the intersectional work to really branch out and be really servicing and really standing in solidarity with your, with immigrant workers, with undocumented workers, with Black and brown people who are facing, violence in their own communities and, elsewhere. And so I see those as opportunities, and I think just like the overall, like how everyone's so much more political now is an opportunity to really talk about working class and unions and bring that back into the fold.
I was saying earlier before we started that I think one of the things I actually really like is that in recent months, and for those of you who maybe have followed what's gone on in media unionism, so you have a handful of different unions that are engaged in organizing media workers. Digital media is kind of at the forefront of it, but still some traditional media is organizing. And there's been sort of an ongoing debate on the internet where, largely, again, like millennial organizers and union staff and workers are debating about whether or not organizers should take a voluntary recognition approach to unionizing, or they should take like a traditional election approach or some hybrid of the two. And like for the people who are engaged in this debate, at some points it's gotten sort of heated, and I just think that the debate is going on is the coolest thing in the world, and it's like a real glimmer of hope that notwithstanding all of the obstacles we're going to face under either of those approaches, given the current like legal climate, that's the level of engagement, is that we're debating tactics. It's not even debating whether or not we should do it. Should you join a union? Are unions good? Which I think was kind of the dialogue, not too long ago. It's now like, what's the best way to get it done? And that's what's causing, tension. I think from a union lawyer, like that's thinking about it from an organizing perspective, I think. But as a lawyer, I think one of the things that's really cool that I'm seeing is I'm a member of the AFL-CIO Lawyers Coordinating Committee. And anybody who represents like an AFL union can be a member of the Lawyers Coordinating Committee, and you go to this conference every year. And you can it's sort of like looking at like what do they call it, like a slice of a tree when you see the rings over history. Like when you sit in these conferences, you can see from a generational perspective that there was this sort of like pale male stale dominance, within my industry as it relates to labor. And as you sort of get back to my generation of lawyer at the very back of the room, often in the way that the people wind up situating themselves, it's become incredibly diverse. and there's this influx of different opinions. The subject matter of these conferences, addresses all kinds of issues that really weren't being discussed among traditional labor not that long ago. So I think that that's another really positive thing if we're trying to look at the silver lining on an otherwise, maybe bleak moment in labor history.
I haven't been here long enough to know what's new, but I think there's a great mobilization amongst high school teachers in West Virginia, and I think they're planning a walkout later this week. So there's clearly things happening, and I think I study history, so in general, I think in American history, like, union participation is higher in times of both economic slump and political misery. So if anything, that's something to hope for, that there will be like more participation. But I also think, I hope that this might be a moment, as you were saying, to like get rank and file to think about things that's more than just about what affects their immediate terms of employment. So the Teaching Assistants Association, which was the first TA union formed in 1966, I think, and they had their first contract in 1969. They actually came out of the free speech movement at Berkeley, and it was very much rooted in the anti-war movement. So it's amazing for us to think that the Graduate Workers Union history had very political beginnings, and it wasn't only about working conditions, but it was very crucially about working conditions and their specific labor performed by graduate laborers as thinkers and political participants, so on and so forth. So I think for the labor movement now, it's potential and also probably an obligation to think about issues of the moment like immigration. So you have to think about immigrant labor, which means it's going to be much more diverse, involve lots of people of color, think of new forms of solidarities, and also think about like global political movements and even like domestic politics and international politics both. So I think this is definitely the kind of moment, because this moment is so politically controversial, it's also an opportunity for the labor movement to find ways of engaging with the most important political issues of the time.
Sort of on that note, I mean, what do you guys think the future of the labor movement looks like? Like where are we heading? And also, like, what changes do we need to see in the labor movement to get there, to adapt to our economy, to adapt to the kinds of concerns that are going to motivate workers, bring them into this movement?
I could start. From a legal perspective, we need to get creative. I don't think it's going to save us, but I think that there are certain things we can do. We can adapt to the moment. Like a specific example, a lot of unions were fighting Citizens United and like made this whole thing about, after Citizens United actually, which is an interesting point. They were like really fighting against the idea about corporate speech and all of this. And this whole like right-wing trend in sort of legal warfare of insisting that we can deregulate all of society on the basis of free speech is something that like right now, because of the way the courts are set up and everything else, we're not going to win the arguments against that. But there are all kinds of things that we can do that will empower unions and workers if we just sort of like use legal judo and go with that. Like some of, corporations have speech now, right, with their money after Citizens United. But unions are subjected to some of like the most stringent restrictions on speech that don't exist anywhere else. Under the National Labor Relations Act, unions can't say things that any other organization can say. And it's all based on who's speaking, which is unconstitutional. So I think that we can actually try things, from a legal perspective without being oppositional, right? I always call it like legal judo. Like we have to use the momentum of the right of the capitalists against them. And the courts are sometimes, if nothing else, a good venue to try to do that in. In terms of what the labor movement will look like in the future, hopefully a lot more like the back of the room at the LCC conferences.
Yeah, I second that. I think it should be way more diverse. I think that the labor movement is already incredibly diverse. I think that you don't see the diversity reflected in bureaucracy and all times like union leadership. And I think that that's something that needs to change. I also think that unions need to not be afraid to be militant in this time, because as you said, we have to get creative, and not only with the law, but like also with our tactics. And a lot of times there's, unions that are afraid to strike. There's unions that are afraid to, encourage the rank and file to take action on its own. And it's like a very top-down strategy. I think that we need to empower union members to take action on the shop floor as they see necessary, as they deem it necessary, and support them all the way through it.
I have no clue what the future of the labor movement looks like, but I'm curious to see what the changing dynamics of some of these large unions will do to what the movement looks like. So we belong to a union of automobile workers, for example, and I think there's so much mutual learning. Like right now, our local is of clerical workers at Columbia University. So the composition is also very different. Like there's a huge section which is the older, more stereotypical white male plant worker, which is not necessarily historically accurate, but it is a great part of the constituency. And then we have clerical workers, which are largely black, very, very diverse. And then you have this group of graduate students, which are also have a very high proportion of international students joining them. So I think there's so much we as graduate workers have to learn from the clerical workers to whose local we belong, and then also the wider automobile workers union. But I have no idea. We haven't been to many events where we interact with our co-union members who work in automobile plants. So I'm very curious about how what kind of politics it generates when these groups of workers come together in these. And I think the working class is not in that sense a set defined thing. It's continuously forming and reforming. So I do think these unions, this particular solidarity, like we have a lot to learn from conversations from them, and vice versa. I think both sides have to learn a lot. And I think movement going forward will probably reflect a lot of that dynamics and this new configuration of very different groups of workers affiliating under same unions.
Forgive me if I'm presuming too much. I think we're all millennials on stage. I'm curious about what it's like organizing millennials in particular, if and when you're coming in contact with them, if they're the next generation of workers. Are they interested in unions? Are they excited about them? Do they have weird ideas about what they are, passed on from, their parents or the media?
So I'll start. I think that while it's encouraging that 3/4 of the growth are millennials, I think in my own personal experience, what I find is that media and propaganda have done a really good job at enforcing this neoliberal, individualistic mindset on millennials, where they really do feel. I think there's an obsession with this professionalism type of class where they don't see themselves as working class folks. You see that sometimes with when we organize in the News Guild, where it's I'm a writer, I'm not a working class, and we're trying to redefine and make them understand that they're working class. But there's also this, with more college graduates nowadays, there's also this mindset that everything should be this meritocracy, where it's based on my own individual performance I will thrive, and who cares about the collective. And so we're trying to shift the conversation, and I think sometimes everybody has their point of entry. It's not going to be always about your workplace. Maybe you'll understand that more in the context of healthcare or housing or another situation. Maybe not immediately your boss though at your job.
I think every organizing campaign that I've worked on in the past few years that I've been counsel to has been a huge concentration of millennials. So it's strange because I feel like the stereotype is so far from the reality that it's crazy. And I can say this, I have to say it sort of a way without approaching client confidences, but with the News Guild, and I hear you in terms of sort of some things you can run into with people who see themselves not as working class and that being problematic. But the millennials, Law 360 unionized a couple years ago by overwhelming majority. They went and they voted. They faced weeks and weeks of a really intense anti-union campaign, and they won with 92 or 93% of the vote. And these were incredibly passionate, totally down millennials who were approaching journalism in a changing world the folks out at the LA Times, heavy concentration of millennials, a lot of veteran journalists too, really incredible veteran journalists, and you see them learning from one another and teaching one another. I mean, I think that the millennial representation in the organizing work that I have done is one of the best things that work has going for it. And it, even in these dark times, I think is something to look forward to, is that you have these people who didn't have any of the questions that, as someone who's done organizing work, I assume people were going to have. The questioning whether or not a union is the right thing to do, like that kind of thing. It wasn't, it was almost like it was a given for a lot of these people walking into it. And maybe there are generational factors, the first generation, they say, that won't be doing as, better than its parents or as good as its parents did economically and things like that. It's like all the promises they made to this generation from an economic perspective won't be fulfilled. We know that now. So, what else are they going to do?
I think my experiences are more in line with yours, but it's a very restricted group, of course, within grad school. I don't know, some of my fellow organizers might have different experiences, but I thought it was very, very, the ways of thinking were very individualistic, and it's difficult, but it's not impossible. That's why we have a union, which is doing pretty well in terms of getting support, but it's a conversation that very often has to be started. I would often find people in the STEM fields who would, there were people who worked part of the Clinton campaign. So you think of it it's going to be political, already political, at least slightly more political than others. So the conversation here is going to be easier, and actually you have to spend much more time there talking about why we actually need a union. And so it is difficult, especially because in academia, this conversation is so, and the labor that you do sometimes, in some cases, is so individualistic. It's very much your relationship with your advisor, or your relationship with your texts and whatever, that it's hard to get people to think in collective interests as well as collective strategies. But once you do, people get, there's a lot of energy and people get really fired up. So in Columbia specifically, there's so much more anger now that Columbia appears to not care about everyone's opinions. And I think we've been saying this for years now, that Columbia does not care, but everyone's suddenly really much madder now because Columbia obviously doesn't care. So, once it takes work to get people to think that there's something in collective action and in thinking of your interests as connected and not just about your merit or your hard work or how lucky you got with your advisor. And, or, we already get good money here. Yeah, should we care about those guys who don't get enough? But once you do get them to think outside of that, I think it really picks up its momentum. And I don't know if it's a millennial thing specifically, but yeah, there's a lot of energy, especially now, I think.